Hello, Tara here. We are on chapter 17 of Not by Sight, and I apologize for all of you who have been waiting anxiously for this chapter. Probably like all two of you. But that's okay, and I'm sorry. We left you on a nice emotional cliffhanger. But here we are in chapter 17. The rest of her day was long and hot as Grace helped Claire in the east field, raking out the hay cuttings Lucy had mown that morning. They had finished up and returned their implements to the barn when Mrs. Vance greeted them. "Mabry, I've a note for you from the manor." She handed over an envelope. Hope flared as Grace took the letter. Was it an invitation? Had Jack forgiven her? "What does it say?" Claire asked. After quickly reading the contents, Grace said, "Lord Roxwood will be in meetings over the next several days, and Mr. Edwards writes to inform me my services will not be needed until further notice." She swallowed past the ache in her throat, then looked at Mrs. Vance. "I suppose it means I'll be working full days now for the WFC. Mrs. Vance smiled. "We're grateful to have you. With all of us pitching in, we can get this hay cut, dried, and ready to bale by Friday." She got back on her bicycle. "I'll see you both at the gatehouse. I'm off to start supper." "Care to tell me what's going on?" Claire asked once their supervisor left. "Why is Lord Roxwood avoiding you?" Grace shrugged. "He's obviously busy." "My foot," said Claire. "There's more to it than that. You haven't said 2 words since you got back this afternoon. Are you all right?" Grace offered a wan smile, and then retrieved her bicycle from where it leaned against the barn. "I'd rather not talk about it." Claire grabbed her own bicycle. "Oh, I see. Lucy and I must tell Grace Mabry all our secrets, while she gets to keep her own?" "I don't make you tell me anything. I simply want to help if I can." "And we don't want to help you?" Claire flashed a hurt look. "I thought we were friends." How had she managed in less than a day to trample the feelings of 2 people she cared about? Claire was right. Grace had adopted the women of the WFC as her sisters. "It's about Jack, Lord Roxwood," she began. "I did meet him before, at a costume ball in London." "I suspected as much." Claire arched a brow. "The day Becky pressed you for information about the Tin Man?" Grace nodded. "And you cleverly turned her attention to something else. Thank you." Claire smiled encouragingly. "Go on." "I'd only read about him in the newspapers, but when I met Jack in person, I thought him the handsomest man in the room. I'd also deemed him a coward." She paused. "I was so angry. Poor Colin was fighting at the front while Jack Benningham and others like him sipped champagne, made jokes, and surrounded themselves with beautiful women." Claire snorted. "So you used the same tar brush you warned me about?" Grace felt renewed shame. "I did." "What happened?" She quickly explained to Claire how she and Agnes had slipped into Lady Bassett's ball with their contraband of white feathers, and told of her encounter with Jack. "Wait. You were one of those brazen women handing out feathers of cowardice?" Claire exclaimed when she'd finished. "And you gave him one?" "Yes, and yes," Grace said. "I felt I was aiding my country and Colin. I didn't know Jack would be at the ball, but he was a known pacifist who had dodged the conscription. How could I resist shaming a man who constantly made the news with his proclivities for gambling, womanizing, and his protests against the war?" "And now he knows it was you?" Claire looked confused. "No. He apparently never learned my identity, nor does he recognize my voice." Her cheeks flushed as she added, "This might sound strange, but neither of us spoke a word that night. We just gazed at each other for the longest time. Then he smiled and took my hand to kiss it, and I smiled back and deposited the white feather into his." Claire burst into laughter. "It's not funny!" Tears pricked her eyes. "Here I thought he'd been injured in the townhouse fire I told you about, but I learned he did go and fight, not long after his encounter with me. Now he's blind and scarred and hiding behind a mask all day." When Claire simply stared at her, she cried, "Don't you understand? It's my fault. I don't see how. The man made his own decision to join the war. He's a member of the peerage, and if I've learned one thing, it's that they always do exactly what they want, regardless of anyone else. Claire's gray eyes softened. You've nothing to feel bad about. Her words echoed Daniel's, but Grace's conscience wasn't convinced. If I hadn't gone to the ball, if I hadn't goaded him, she said, Jack never would have enlisted and taken such chances. He wouldn't have gotten hurt. If this, if that, Claire said, mounting her bicycle. Only God knows what goes through a man's mind, Grace, not you or me. You may regret your actions, but Lord Roxwood, or Jack Benningham, did as he saw fit, and that's an end to it. You can't blame yourself. I feel cowardly, Grace admitted. I should at least tell him it was me. Ask for his forgiveness. But it's so difficult. You'll just make things worse. He'll still be blind and scarred, and have lost a friend. Claire paused. Oh dear. You've fallen for him, haven't you? Grace looked away. Claire said softly, We talked about this, remember? He's not free to marry, and you cannot afford to settle for anything less. Trust me, you'll only get your heart broken, my friend. It's not something you want to go through. I'm afraid it's too late. My heart is breaking, she whispered. This morning we went to a place, Eden he calls it, and Jack took off his mask for me. He wanted me to see him, warts and all. Her voice broke. I'm afraid I reacted badly. Oh dear, Claire said again, reaching across the handlebars to clasp Grace's hand. His appearance took me by surprise. Not because of his scars, they aren't so terribly bad, but his eyes looked right through me, and I knew I did it to him. I'm so sorry, Claire offered. But before you do anything rash, why don't you wait and see what tomorrow brings? If he asks you to drive him in the morning, then you'll know he's forgiven you for his reaction today. Grace held up the letter. I cannot imagine he will. You don't know for certain. Besides, if he cares about you as much as I suspect he does, he won't wish you to stay away. Now, come on. Supper's waiting. A full stomach will lift your spirits and clear your head in no time. The next 3 mornings dawned clear and bright, and Grace would have preferred to be with Jack rather than raking hay cuttings into long rows beneath a hot sun. Still, the hard work eased her aching heart while she tried to sort out her thoughts. So my spirit grows faint within me, my heart within me is dismayed. She made another swipe with the rake at the dried grass, then straightened, stretching her cramped back muscles. The verse, another from Psalm 143, seemed to speak to her misery. She should have told Jack the truth on Monday. Then he would have understood her reaction, that it wasn't him who failed to measure up, but her. More than once she'd considered going to him, since the moment Lucy came back from the manor yesterday bursting with good news. Jack had offered her a position at Stonebrook. Sir Marcus felt the banished young man might still cause trouble, so Jack decided Lucy would be much safer in the north at his family's estate. Grace was grateful to him. She'd known he would be willing to help her friend, and hearing of his kindness only made her miss him all the more. Grace! She turned to see Mrs. Vance hailing her from the edge of the field. Grace, Dr. Strom needs a word with you. Grace felt her own erratic pulse. Cousin Daniel wanted to speak with her? Pulling off her gloves, she dropped them beside her rake and walked to her supervisor. He's waiting for you in the barn. Hurry now. Mrs. Vance's furrowed brow and drawn mouth heightened Grace's alarm, and she moved at a half-run toward the large structure. She found her cousin inside the shadowy confines, waiting for her. Is it Jack? Lord Roxwell? Is he unwell? She asked. Daniel removed his felt cap, his expression somber. Sit down, Grace. Was Jack's condition worse than she imagined? Grace bit back her anxiety and sat on a milk crate. Tell me, she breathed, afraid of his answer. I'm not here about Lord Roxwood, he said gently. Her confusion turned to cold, hard dread. Colin, he nodded, and Grace teetered dizzily on her perch. He reached to steady her. He's not dead? She whispered, unable to believe it. As far as we know right now, he's alive. He's been listed as missing. A cry escaped from her as she launched from her seat, grabbing his sleeve. How? He held her by the shoulders. Your father telephoned me at home, and I came here directly. I'm told every effort is being made to find your brother. Her mind reeled as she thought of the worries she'd been feeling about her twin. Real fear took hold of her. Where was he last seen? She demanded. How long has he been missing? Do you know if he was injured? Easy. He helped her back to her seat. We have nothing yet, but the army will tell us when they have information. In the meantime, you must try and stay calm. Calm? She wailed. When my brother might be lying injured or dead? She bit down hard against her lip. We must do something, she said, searching his face. Anything. For now, we must wait, he said in a firmer tone. Mrs. Vance has agreed you should return to your billet and lie down. I'll give you something to help you sleep. You're already exhausted, and this news has certainly given you a shock. He grasped her hand. Come along. She followed him outside. Mrs. Vance stood beside Daniel's car, wringing her hands. The older woman's hazel eyes shone with tears. Mrs. Vance will accompany us and see you settled. Tomorrow, after you've had a good night's rest, we can decide on how to proceed. I must go home. Grace shook off her stupor and pulled away from him. Da needs me. Of course. I'll accompany you to London on the train. He placed a hand on her shoulder. Have faith, child, and pray for your brother's safe return. Pray. She looked toward the fields. But I haven't told him. She turned back to her cousin. Jack, the white feather. Her head began to pound, and she felt as though the earth might swallow her up. I've been so foolish. Now Colin is gone and they'll never find him. It's foolishness, all right, Daniel said. I know what you're thinking, but God doesn't work that way, Grace. He doesn't make deals, and I don't believe he's punishing you for anything. His aged features softened. Do you understand what I'm saying? She nodded, only half listening. Good, he said. Now, I'll drive you both back to the gatehouse. Grace lay on her bed several hours later, having taken the headache powder her cousin prescribed, but refusing anything stronger. Eyes closed, she imagined all kinds of horrible scenarios. Colin sprawled on the muddy battlefield, injured and bleeding, or perhaps he'd been captured and was being tortured even now behind enemy lines. Guilt threatened to suffocate her, and she was again reminded of the torment in her mother's expression as she'd stared up from the bed at her only son, Colin, standing in uniform, looking proud, his gaze burning with his sister's ideals. Dear Lord, what have I done? Tears rolled down the sides of her face. She recalled the young soldiers at the dance. Some were mangled and maimed, while others, perhaps like Jack's brother, wore their damage on the inside. Even Jack suffered living in darkness. War is an ugly business, Grace. She knew from Colin's old letters that he slept in muddy trenches and ate stale rations. And while London had received many air attacks, the bombings hadn't been on a grand scale. Grace had never actually seen any of the damage herself. Yet now with her brother missing, perhaps near death, the war had become painfully close. She didn't sense her twin was dead, at least not yet, but she worried he might never be found. Lord, please save him, she cried into her blanket. I made a terrible mistake. Show me the way I should go, for to you I entrust my life. The psalmist's verse penetrated her senses. Perhaps God didn't make deals, but Grace couldn't shake the belief that her wrongs outweighed her desires. In your righteousness, bring me out of trouble. She threw off her blankets, and with shaking hands, she laced up her boots and gaiters. Grace knew what she must do. Praying for Colin with a clear conscience meant first making peace with God, and with Jack. Miss Mabry? Noel's weathered features registered surprise as he answered her summons that afternoon. I must speak with him. Is something amiss? Grace caught his swift perusal of her. She still wore her dirty uniform from the field. Despite her struggle to stay composed, her voice trembled when she said, "Please, it's important." "My lord is resting," Knowles said. He wasn't as ebullient as he'd been on Monday, but his look of indecision was a far cry from his usual staidness. "Could you perhaps call tomorrow?" "I cannot." She reached for his sleeve, tears threatening to blur her vision. "Please, I just received urgent news. I must meet with Lord Roxwood before I go." Her voice broke, and his features transformed into a look of genuine concern. "Miss Mabry, I truly hope it is nothing dire." He cleared his throat and added, "I will of course notify his lordship." He paused. "But is it quite necessary you must leave us?" She nodded. "I'm needed back in London." The butler hesitated, then stood aside to allow her entrance. "Please wait inside." While he disappeared to make the request, Grace stood in the foyer and tried to imagine her conversation with Jack. Would he even agree to meet with her before she left? She said a quick prayer he would at least give her an audience. Allow her to try to make amends to him, for her brother's sake, if nothing else. "Good day, Miss Mabry." Mr. Edwards appeared from down the hall. "His lordship will see you. Please follow me." He led her back down the hall to the study. Grace had been inside only once before, when the steward arranged her contract as chauffeur. She recalled that day, and Jack's cold and distant manner toward her, so different from the man with whom she'd shared candy floss at Margate, and danced in a quiet corner of Roxwood's community hall. That was before she'd let her guilt wound him. How would he behave toward her now? "Miss Mabry, my lord," Edwards announced, opening the door to the study. To Grace he said, "You may go in," and gestured with a sweep of his arm. She entered, and the steward closed the door, leaving her alone with Jack. Her nerves stretched as she walked deeper into the room, which was silent but for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. Quickly she surveyed the masculine surroundings, the dark wood paneling and oak bookcase lining one wall, and across the room the massive cherrywood desk that now sat empty. She turned toward the unlit fireplace and glimpsed Jack's long legs as he sat with his back to her in a leather-upholstered chair near the hearth. Grace inhaled a shallow breath. "Hello, Jack." Despite his anger, Jack's pulse leaped at the sound of her voice. Having kept her away already 3 days, he'd counted the hours he hadn't heard her speak, or felt her touch, or breathed in the faint, familiar scent of her. He missed their conversations, their laughter. Regardless of her open rejection of him, he had felt her absence to his core. "You're pathetic, Benningham." The silence was deafening but for the clock, and he rose from his chair, turning in her direction. "Edward said you had urgent news." "I've come to tell you I'm leaving for London in the morning." He grabbed at the back of the chair. Did she find him so repulsive, then, she must abandon her position entirely? His throat ached as he fought for composure. "Miss Mabry, I can understand how I caused you embarrassment the other day." "You didn't embarrass me," she whispered. "My own behavior was abominable, and I've come to apologize." "My mistake," he bit out, as the sound of her pity renewed his anger. "I should have realized how you would react." He let go of the chair and advanced a step. "Is that why you're leaving Roxwood?" "I received news that my brother, he's missing in action." Hearing her anguish, Jack abandoned all pretenses at salvaging his wounded pride. "Grace, I'm sorry." He took a few more steps forward, closing the distance between them. "How did you find out?" "My cousin, Dr. Strom. He spoke with my father on the telephone this morning. I must go home and be with my da while we wait for news from the army." Her news struck him like blows. Jack hated the idea she would return to her blackguard of a father. "Is there anything I can do?" "Cousin Daniel said we must wait." Bitterness edged her words. His gut tightened. Marcus might be able to help. His friend had high connections in the army. "Thank you." Jack felt a warm hand clasp his own. "I promise you, Grace, we'll find out what's being done to find your brother," he said. "Jack, There's another reason I'm here." She withdrew her touch then, and a sense of loss filled him. A moment later, Jack felt her warm hands along either side of his face. He steeled himself as her fingers grazed featherlight over the scar at his cheek. "To seek your forgiveness." Her whisper, so close to his lips, tantalized him, yet he would rather die than become the object of her charity. "I told you. It was my error in judgment." "No, I need to confess something else, far worse than my behavior at Eden." What could be worse than her rejection? Unless... Coldness swept over him as he thought of her father. "You have a secret to share?" "I want to see you, Jack." Her hands slid around to the ties at his mask. Jack tried to pull away, but she held tight. "Please, trust me," she said. His heart hammered against his chest as he went still. Soon, the air touched his exposed flesh, and the room felt silent except for the sound of their breathing. Why was he allowing this torment? He imagined her repulsion, knew he couldn't stand her rejection a second time. Her gentle touch startled him. "I thought you so handsome that night at the ball, with your midnight cape and your red rose." She spoke softly as she trailed a finger over the uneven skin of his scars. "Women flocked to you as they once must have done with the real Casanova." His body stiffened, her words hitting him like a shockwave. "You?" he breathed. "You were at the Dowager's party?" Warm hands cupped his face. "I was so angry with you," she said, ignoring his question. "You and your pacifist friends lazing about while my brother fought in the trenches and the enemy's bombs fell on London. The war had to be won." She paused. "I thought to shame you in front of your peers and gave you the white feather." "Pandora?" Stunned, he reached for her hands against his face. "Yes, it was me." Tears edged her voice. "And in my effort to teach you a lesson, Jack Benningham, I nearly destroyed you." Her breath shook. "It's my fault you cannot see." He felt dazed. "I cannot believe... Jasmine," he said, recalling the scent of flowers surrounding her at the ball. And when Marcus had described her auburn hair and green eyes to him, he'd imagined the beautiful goddess in green who had captured his attentions that night. It now seemed perfectly reasonable Grace would be the same woman. "I was just as surprised as you when we met in your hedge maze," she said. "You were this tin man the villagers spoke of. I'd read in the Times about your injuries. I chose to believe you'd gotten drunk and set your own house ablaze." Her voice dropped. "I assumed that you deserved your fate. Oh, Jack, I'm so ashamed." She tried pulling away from him, but his grip held her firmly. Finally, she quit her struggle and said in a sad voice, "I kept my secret at first, not because I regretted my actions, but I feared you would be furious and banish me from Roxwood. I didn't want to return home to what awaited me there." Ironic, isn't it? Anguished humor colored her tone. "Now I am leaving, and of my own will." "Grace, you don't need to do this." "Please let me finish." Her breath trembled between them. "When I learned the truth, that you were injured in the line of duty and not by some house fire as everyone thought, I realized how badly I'd misjudged you. I felt horrible for having shamed you into enlisting. And the other day at Eden, when you took off your mask, I couldn't bear knowing what I had done to you. Please forgive me." "Forgive?" Jack's confusion cleared the second he realized Grace felt she was to blame for his injuries. She couldn't know her effect on him the night of the ball, or how the feather had amused him, until Chaplin made his escape. He released her hands and dug into his waistcoat pocket, retrieving the talisman he'd kept with him the past few months. "I believe this once belonged to you." Shocked, Grace stared at the white feather in his grasp. "You kept it?" He twirled it between his thumb and forefinger. "Amazing, but when they fished me from the Thames, your token of affection managed to remain with me." He smiled. "This feather and your lovely image have haunted my dreams for months." "But the memory, I was responsible for you getting hurt." "Grace, I was already in the service to the crown the night I met you." He returned the feather to his pocket. Your boldness provided me a pleasant diversion, nothing more." The knowledge eased her conscience considerably. Then she recalled his words at the village dance, his high-stakes job. "Did you work with Marcus at the Admiralty?" "Yes, I'd been working at my position for some time," he said. "I knew the risks, so there is nothing to forgive. You would have felt much better had you told me sooner." "I thought you would despise me." "Never," he whispered. He reached out to her, and she again put her hands in his. "I did consider baring my soul to you once or twice," Grace admitted. "But I was afraid to take the chance. Then news came about Colin, and I worried—" "About what?" She hesitated, then said, "We've already discussed your views on the subject of God and religion, so you'll think me silly. But I desired a clear conscience, to pray for my brother." "Clear conscience or not, the Almighty does what he likes and we have no say in it. But if it makes you feel better, Grace," he said, smiling, "I forgive you." "Thank you." Impulsively, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his scarred cheek. He gripped her hands. "What was that for?" The mantel clock chimed the hour. "I should go," she said, instead, unwilling to reveal her true feelings. "I didn't tell anyone I was leaving the gatehouse. I don't want them to worry." "Will you ever come back to Roxwood?" Tension colored his tone. Grace's heart ached at the thought of leaving him. "I don't believe so," she said truthfully. "The Women's Forage Corps will finish work next week, and then move on to another estate. I'll likely remain in London until word arrives about my brother." She stepped back, and he released his grip. "Thank you for offering to help, Jack." He nodded. "Will you call me?" "You wish me to?" "What do you think?" Jack again reached for her and this time pulled her into his arms. Grace hesitated, but then relaxed against him, feeling comforted by his strength. She rested her head against his chest and felt his heart beating as fast as her own. "Do you have any idea how much I'm going to miss you?" he whispered close to her ear. His breath tickled her skin and she tilted her face upward. "How much?" she whispered back, knowing the danger of such a question. His sculpted lips smiled at her irresistibly. "Kiss me and I'll show you." His gentle voice caressed like the rustling grasses of the field. Grace gazed at him, mesmerized, longing to feel the touch of his lips against hers. But she resisted. "We haven't the right." Yet as she spoke, she gave in to temptation and reached to trace along the edge of his mouth. "And I don't want my heart broken." He caught her hand, kissing her fingertip. "I won't break it." He leaned to touch his head against hers. She felt his warm breath on her cheek. "I promise." There were so many reasons she shouldn't kiss him. She would likely never see him again after today, and Jack must marry and eventually lay claim to his title as Earl. He'd be provided with a legion of chauffeurs at his disposal, and would have no further use for the daughter of an Irish tea-man. As she mentally cited all the reasons against it, Grace pressed close and touched her lips to his. Let this be their parting then, she thought, surrendering not to reason but to her heart. But as he deepened the kiss, drawing her ever tighter into the circle of his arms, passion unfurled between them, like petals of his most prized rose. His fingers graced lightly over her face as he put to memory each and every line of her features. She sensed in him a longing, tasting the loneliness he would face in the days to come. Surrounded by him, she breathed in the spice of his bay rum cologne, mingled with the touch of aged leather and the scent that was uniquely Jack Benningham. Lord Roxwood, Viscount of Wallingford, heir to the Earl of Stonebrook. A man she could never have, and one with whom she'd foolishly fallen in love. Oh! Nice. See you soon.